What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Sponsored by peer-run support communities Freedom Center, the Icarus Project, and Portland Hearing Voices. Madness Radio can be heard on FM stations on the Pacifica Radio Network and is online at kboo.fm/madnessradio. Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall. Today my guest is Fritjof Capra. Fritjof is a theoretical physicist and systems theorist, author of several international best-selling books, including The Dao Physics, The Web of Life, and Hidden Connections. His most recent book is The Systems View of Life, co-authored with Pierre Luigi Luisi. Welcome to Madness Radio, Fritjof Capra.
Well, it's a great pleasure, Will, to be on your show, and I look forward to our conversation.
Now, I think a lot of our listeners may be familiar with your classic book from 1975, Dao Physics, and for many, many years you have been a leading light in trying to get at some of the philosophical and scientific thinking underpinning of what is the broader human crisis that we're in. And so I am very grateful for your work and for your books, and it's an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you.
And let's see, so, I think it's very interesting. You have a journey from a theoretical physicist to someone who got interested in Eastern philosophy and Eastern spirituality and the connections between the two. And now you have written this book, The Systems View of Life, which is really a textbook about a kind of a deeper, holistic, ecological revision of the sciences and how we think about the world and ourselves and knowledge, which has huge implications for mental health and healthcare. How did you kind of make that journey from a theoretical physicist to begin with?
My childhood does have an influence because, for one thing, I grew up on a farm. I spent the first 10 years of my life on a farm in southern Austria. And this was during and just after World War II. So the farm was totally self-sufficient. The economy of the country had broken down after the war. And so there was not much you could buy in shops. So we had our own vegetables, we had our fruits, we had our pigs for sausages, we had our cows, goat, chickens, and so on. And, we baked our bread and we pressed oil and cider. So it was a completely self-sufficient and, as you would now say, sustainable system. And it was a large community because it belonged to my grandmother and then my aunt. And so various members of my extended family came to live on the farm because, we sought shelter on this farm, which was sort of an oasis amidst the war and post-war trauma. And there were a lot of refugees seeking shelter on the farm. So what I'm saying is that my sense of ecology, being out in nature on a farm for the first 10 years of my life, and the sense of community, which is also very important for sustainability, that was really nurtured in my early childhood.
Yeah, that's really remarkable. Also, the contrast between that sort of very positive, idealistic vision of how people can live together and take care of each other in a sustainable way in the context of this catastrophe that has happened in the surround. And that's kind of like an imprint of your work in general, it seems.
Yes. I I came to realize this, long after I wrote my books.
Wow.
Just very recently. Now, the other thing that I think is relevant, now I'm moving on to my teenage years, which I spent in Innsbruck in the middle of the Alps. So the mountains are very important for me. And I still go to Innsbruck. I have an apartment there. I speak the local dialect, and I'm still very much at home there. So, but I also need to tell you that my mother was a poet, and my father was a lawyer, but was also a sort of amateur philosopher and a great lover of the arts. So in my later childhood, the arts played a major role. Innsbruck is not far from Italy. We went to Italy every summer. We went to all these great museums and saw the Renaissance and the Italian Baroque and so on. And so, and there was a lot of talk about philosophy around the dinner table. So, although I became interested in mathematics and in science, in physics during my high school years, my background in my education was always much broader and always included philosophy and the arts. I think that's an important fact also.
That's an extraordinary kind of multidisciplinary upbringing that you had that definitely feeds right into all of your work, all those different elements.
In addition to speaking several languages, you see, Austria is sort of in the middle of Europe. And when we had the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, this was a multicultural and multilingual country. And so many of my friends in Austria, family and friends, speak at least 2 foreign languages. You know, I happen to speak 4, but it's sort of a little bit of an exception. But 1 or 2 foreign languages are very common in Austria. So all this is sort of the systemic roots, if you want, of my childhood and youth.
So how did you end up getting interested in mathematics and physics then?
My interest in mathematics began, I think I was around 15 in high school, and I had a young and very enthusiastic mathematics teacher who really kindled an interest in me in formulas, in geometry, in abstract thinking, you know, all these wonders of mathematics. And I had several, you know, high school friends, 1 or 2, who shared that interest. And so we would read books on mathematics and we would pester our teacher with questions. I remember, you know, he would talk about unsolved problems in mathematics. And we would say, well, if we solve this, do we get the Nobel Prize? And he said, no, not quite. But if you solve this problem, you will get it for sure, you know? So it was very creative. I should also tell you that my physics teacher in high school was very bad, a very bad teacher. So I wasn't interested in physics, you know? Then I went to university, and in my first year of an undergraduate, the situation switched. My mathematics professor was very boring and uninspiring. And my physics professor of theoretical physics was very flamboyant, very inspiring, very enthusiastic. So in the first year, I switched my major from mathematics to physics. So it's interesting how this can influence you. So being interested also in philosophy, I came across a book which had just been published by the famous Werner Heisenberg, one of the founders of quantum physics. And the book is called Physics and Philosophy. In this book, Heisenberg describes the very exciting period of the 1920s and 1930s, when there was a handful of physicists, Heisenberg, Bohr, Pauli, Schrödinger, and so on, who were faced with a very new and unexpected reality, the reality of atomic and subatomic phenomena. And they just couldn't find the proper language to describe them. And that threw them into a deep crisis, which Heisenberg describes very vividly in his book. And out of this crisis then came the new understanding of matter in quantum theory and relativity theory. So I read this book as a young student, and it's very philosophical, but it's also very technical. And I understood only about half of it. But this book remained my companion through my career as a physicist. And in particular, Heisenberg describes the puzzles that they had to confront when they asked nature a question, as he put it. They would do experiments with electrons, for instance, and at certain times, electrons would appear as particles. At other times, they would appear as waves. And so they didn't know what was going on. Was an electron a particle or was it a wave? You see, a particle is very different from a wave. It's very localized. A wave is spread out. So they really didn't know what was going on. And that threw them into a sort of conceptual and even existential crisis. Now, years later, when I got my PhD and moved to Paris for my first postdoc, I got my PhD in 1967. Now we are in 1968, and that's when I got in touch with Eastern philosophy. This is also very interesting how I got in touch with Eastern philosophy. It was through poetry. You will remember the beat poems, the beat poets in San Francisco, Ferlinghetti, Kerouac, Gary Snyder, and so on. I read their poetry in the late 1960s, and through this poetry, I got interested in Zen Buddhism and in Hinduism and Taoism and so on. That's how I got into Eastern philosophy. And when I studied the writings of Eastern philosophies, I read the Bhagavad Gita and I read the books by D.T. Suzuki about Zen Buddhism. And almost immediately, I saw some parallels to this book by Werner Heisenberg, Physics and Philosophy, because those Zen students are also confronted with puzzles that don't have a rational answer. And so they are called koans. It's a particular technique of teaching Zen. And so I was thinking that those quantum experiments in atomic physics were sort of quantum koans. And that's sort of origin of comparing modern physics and Eastern philosophy.
And so the quantum physicists, I mean, when they were confronting this paradox at the heart of what it is, the building blocks of matter, right? And they're not sure exactly what they're seeing. They start to consider that there actually might be some sort of mystical or spiritual or some kind of almost religious validity to what they're seeing. That they're observing concrete material phenomenon, but they're defying the laws that they thought were supposed to be there, and then they start to open up to some of these more spiritual views. Is that?
Historically, the quantum physicists, I don't think, were deeply religious people. There might have been spiritual people. That's certainly true for Niels Bohr, who was sort of almost like a guru to the other physicists. When quantum physics had been established and the theory had been completed, these people wrote popular books about it, and they traveled around the world. They were invited to lectures and conferences, and so they got in touch with other philosophies. So Heisenberg, for instance, was the guest of Rabindranath Tagore in India and had long conversations with him about the nature of reality seen from the Indian perspective. Bohr went to China and Japan and got in touch with the Taoist concepts of yin and yang and compared them to his views of complementarity in quantum physics. And so they made contact, but the contact was more intellectual, I would say. It didn't come from a spiritual basis. When I got interested in Eastern philosophy, it was both a philosophical interest and a spiritual interest. And, this was, of course, the period of the 1960s, the counterculture or time of the hippies, when we were disenchanted with sort of rational Western culture, with the money-making, corporate spirit, and also with the rational approaches to the churches, especially both the Catholic and Protestant churches. And so we were looking for other ways of finding spiritual experience. And we experimented with psychedelics, and we practiced yoga, we practiced meditation, and got very much involved in these Eastern philosophies.
And there was also a sense that the world is kind of in crisis, that there's a there's a breaking down of the old order, and there needs to be some sort of transformation, even though it was the very, very early time of the ecology movement, and there wasn't even much of an awareness of the possibilities that we might be facing, the kind of crisis that we're in now, but there was some sense of that might be coming.
There was no awareness of a global environmental crisis, but there was an awareness of an ecological lifestyle. And, people were living on farms and, living on the land, organic food, vegetarian cooking, all this was very fashionable. I mean, I cooked myself for years, I cooked vegetarian meals for years, and many of my friends did. So that part of ecology was already there, but ecology as a political movement came in the 1970s.
And so then, is that when you wrote the Tao of Physics?
Well, yes, the Dao Physics I wrote in London. I lived in California from 1968 to 70. Then I moved to London and spent 4 years at Imperial College. I was still a working physicist doing research in high energy physics. And in London, I began to really absorb and digest the parallels between modern physics and Eastern philosophy that had struck me so much a couple of years before. And I began to do a systematic research of Eastern philosophy. I read books, I went to libraries and so on. And this was not easy because when you are a physicist, you need to be paid either by a university as a teacher or you get a research grant. And I was not interested anymore in being a full-time physicist. I wanted to write this book. And so I had to drop out of physics because there's no part-time physicist. Either you're there full-time or you're not there. So after 4 years at Imperial College, I dropped out of physics and, did all kinds of side jobs, like doing translations, teaching in high schools and so on to make a living, but writing the Tao of Physics at the same time. This was from around 72 to 74, and the book was published in 75.
And it's caused a huge impact. I mean, this is a very, very influential book. It's been translated to a number of different languages and has presented this kind of vision of where we might go as a culture. Yeah.
The impact of the book was much bigger than I had ever imagined, ever dreamt of. I remember when I lived in London. London in the 70s was very exciting too. And I had many friends who were artists, who were writers. I would ask some writer friends of mine while I was working on the book what they thought a bestseller was, and they said, well, if you sell 10,000 copies of your book, you can call it a bestseller. Well, the Tao of Physics has now sold over 1 million copies. So I never expected that kind of success.
And why do you think it was so popular?
Well, I think it was so popular because it hit a nerve. The fact that, in a larger sense, the mechanistic worldview had outlived its usefulness. Seeing the world as a machine did not help us any longer to make progress, both in the sciences and in applied fields like medicine or management or psychotherapy or industrial design. All of these fields had come to the end of the mechanistic worldview, and something new was needed. And also the same experience I had in the 1960s, and many of my fellow hippies in the counterculture had, was that the technological optimism of the Western lifestyle and the materialism was too dry and not satisfying, and we were longing for something deeper. Well, 10 years later, when the Dao Physics was published, this was felt by thousands of people, if not millions, around the world. And I think that unusual combination of spirituality and a science that is holistic and ecological was just a very powerful message. And I can tell you, Will, that after the success of the book, I got invited to give lectures and seminars to many, many people. So people from all walks of life would often come to me after the lecture and say, you have said something that I have felt for a long time, but wasn't able quite to express. And you have expressed it in words. So that was a common trend, that people had felt that intuitively. And I, expressed it in words.
So you mentioned the mechanistic worldview. What is a mechanistic view? Why has that touched so many people to identify that and say we need to move beyond it? And what is it that's so negative or dangerous or limiting about this mechanistic view?
The mechanistic worldview was a huge success for about 300 years, from the 17th to the 20th century. So it goes back to Galileo, Descartes, and Newton, and Bacon, the sort of heroes of the scientific revolution in the 17th century. And Descartes, who is one of the key authors or fathers of the mechanistic worldview, Descartes lived at the end of the Middle Ages, where European culture was very strongly influenced by the church. And the Pope essentially decided, what was the correct worldview and what was incorrect or heretical. And Descartes said, I don't need the Pope to tell me what the world is like. I can find out myself. And I will do so. And to do so, I will assume the world is a machine. At that time, engineers were constructing little automata, singing birds, dancing ballerinas, that were little machine clockworks, The clockwork had reached a high perfection. And so, Descartes said, let's assume the world is a clockwork and see how far we can get with that. Well, the error was that in subsequent centuries, because this was so successful, it was no longer treated as a model, but as the truth. And people thought the world really is a machine. And of course, this mechanistic model, although it was successful in astronomy and in a lot of branches of physics, it can only be taken so far. And for instance, in medicine, mechanistic medicine says, if you are sick, then Descartes actually said that himself, a sick body is like a malfunctioning clock. And what you have to do to fix it is to find the part that is not functioning. And either you take it out with surgery, or you fix it chemically or with some other means. And then the clock will function again. Well, this applies only in a very, very limited way, because my health is not the sum of the health of my parts, but derives from the processes and relationships involving those parts. So there's a shift from the parts to the whole, from objects to relationships, from machine to the network. That's essentially the paradigm shift from the mechanistic to the holistic or systemic view.
And the idea that the part is broken seeks the problem within the machine rather than seeing this person as part of a context and being part of systems within systems within systems, which may actually be responding and reacting to and relating to things outside of something inside of it. I mean, we clearly see this as a fallacy in mental health care and psychiatry. We often talk about the medical model and we have to go beyond the medical model. Well, maybe there's nothing wrong with medicine. Maybe the problem is that there's a mechanistic view of the mind and a mechanistic view of emotions and a mechanistic view that we can just fix it with pills, or there must be something broken inside of you that we're going to go in and adjust, like working on a machine.
The key error of this biomedical model of medicine, in my view, is the confusion between the origin of an illness and the manifestation in various malfunctioning processes. So they take the malfunctioning processes as the cause and say, you are sick because, a part of your stomach doesn't function well. So we'll give you some drugs to make it function again. But there's a reason why the parts of the stomach don't function well. The reason may be that you are under tremendous emotional stress. And so, the gut has certain, parts that respond to stress, as we all know. And so if you just fix that and the stress persists, well, then the illness may just express itself in another way, not in the stomach, but maybe in the heart or in the brain or in other parts.
What is it about life and living organisms that are so distinct and so significant that we can't just borrow the understandings and the metaphors and the ideas of physics to understand?
Well, living organisms have various qualities and various properties, some of which have been known since Aristotle and the Greeks, properties that are strikingly different from non-living matter. Let me mention a few of them. When you have a living organism, you observe that there is always flow and change. We need to take in a constant stream of energy and matter to stay alive. We need to breathe in air, we need to eat, we need to drink, and we excrete waste. So there's a flow of energy and matter through the living organism. The energy and matter are absorbed, are integrated into the body, into the organism, and yet, in spite of this constant change of parts, there's an overall stability. The overall pattern of the organism is preserved. So this coexistence of stability and change is a key characteristic of life. Well, then we can go to adaptation. Living organisms can adapt to changing situations. When I'm sitting here now in my office. When I go outside, it's hot outside. When I go into the sun, my body temperature will rise, but not that much. It will stay more or less the same because the organism has a way to keep it in balance. Technically, this is known as homeostasis. Well, non-living matter doesn't have that. Living organisms also reproduce. Minerals do not reproduce. They adapt, they evolve. They are individuals. When you take a hydrogen atom, one atom is exactly like every other atom. When you take the leaves on a tree, every leaf is different. It has the same general shape, but has its individuality. So all of this makes living systems very different from non-living systems.
And this also applies to the social and the cultural realm because those are made up of living organisms and living systems.
Now, moving to social networks, we are not talking about chemical processes here. We're talking about communications. As everybody knows today, a social network is a network of communications. But interestingly, like the biological networks, the social network continually regenerates itself. Why? Because every communication triggers a response, triggers comments, triggers other communications. Just, imagine the social media on the internet, once you put out a tweet, it gets retweeted, it gets reactions And eventually the entire network of communications produces and maintains itself. And the same for ecological networks, which are networks of feeding relationships, of food webs. So the synthesis I'm providing makes the connection between the biology, the social dimension, and the ecological dimension. And the fourth one is the cognitive dimension, which should interest you, especially because it's really relevant to your field.
Yeah, well, this has been the sort of the question that the Cartesian model presents us with, is that how do you get mind out of matter? How does the machine of the body presumably generate consciousness? But what I think is so interesting about what you're discussing and the systems view of life is that it's a very different view of what actually cognition and what actually mind is. So tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, the puzzle of what is the mind and what is the relationship between mind and body, between mind and brain, has been a puzzle for centuries, ever since Descartes. And actually, Descartes, in a sense, is the main culprit here, because Descartes began his philosophy of nature by dividing the world into two separate and independent realms, that of mind, which he called the thinking thing, in Latin res cogitans, and that of matter, which he called the extended thing, in Latin res extensa. And following Descartes, scientists and philosophers continued to think of the mind as a thing, as some kind of intangible entity. And then they were unable to imagine how this thinking thing is related to the body. So the decisive advance of the systems view of life has been to realize that mind is not a thing, it is a process. And the process is now called cognition. And this novel concept of mind was developed in the 1960s already, independently by Gregory Bateson, an anthropologist who was also one of the founders of cybernetics, and by Umberto Maturana, who was also came out of the cybernetics movement and who is a neuroscientist in Chile.
And the cybernetics movement, that's the systems thinking.
That's part of the systems thinking. That's a very part of the systems thinking, yes. And then in the 1970s, Maturana and his colleague Francisco Varela, both working at the University of Chile in Santiago, created a whole theory of cognition, which is now known as the Santiago theory of cognition. And what it says is essentially that cognition, the process of knowing, is very closely associated with the very process of life. Cognition, according to Maturana and Varela, is the activity involved in the self-generation and self-perpetuation of living networks. So cognition and the living networks, their theory of living networks, which is also due to Maturana and Varela, and is known as autopoiesis, which means self-making. This theory of autopoiesis is very closely related to their theories of cognition. So what this means is that the interactions of a living organism, plant, animal, or human, or even a microbe, with its environment are cognitive interactions. And so life and cognition are inseparably connected. Mind, or accurately mental activity, is immanent in matter at all levels of life. So this is a very radical expansion of the concept of mind. And in this view, cognition involves the entire process of life, including perception, emotion, behavior, and does not even necessarily require a brain and a nervous system. Plants, for example, don't have a nervous system, don't have a brain, but they are cognitive systems, they are intelligent systems. So this is a revolutionary advance and it has given rise to a whole new field of cognitive science, which is a new multidisciplinary field.
And so let's think about the implications of this in terms of healthcare or mental health care, because immediately what comes to me is that, an individual may come to me for help and they may say, I've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Can you help me figure out, what medication or medications are working for me? Help me figure out what's kind of inside of my head that needs to be fixed. And what I will do instead is help there be a shift to just stepping back from seeing it within that individual head and start to discuss about the entire context and the whole living reality that the person is in, which is about their relationships, it's about their work, it's about the place that they live, it's about their relationship to nature, it can be about their nutrition, all the different things. So there's some very, very radical shift, and it seems to me that maybe other areas of science and other areas of society are moving in this direction of this paradigm shift away from a mechanistic view, but unfortunately psychiatry is maybe lagging behind in some ways.
Yeah. Well, let me talk a little more about health. And first of all, this Santiago view of cognition as the process of life solves a puzzle that has plagued scientists and philosophers for centuries. The puzzle which I've mentioned already. What is the relationship exactly between the mind and the brain? It has been known for a long time that mental activity involves the brain, but what is the exact relationship? And even in textbooks as recently as maybe 20 years ago or 10 years ago, the authors of these textbooks on neuroscience didn't have a clue about what the relationship is between mind and brain. Well, in the Santiago theory, this relationship is very clear and very simple. Mind or cognition is the process of life, and the brain is a particular structure within which this process takes place. The brain is not the only structure, but it is, in higher organisms, a very important structure. So the relationship between mind and brain is a relationship between process and structure. And in all living systems, you always have to deal with both process and structure, because as I mentioned before, living structure is always changing, always moving, always evolving. There is no such thing as a static living structure. And the process of life, of course, cannot take place in a vacuum. It needs matter, it needs biology to express itself. So process and structure are sort of two sides of the same coin of life. And therefore, coming now to health, every process that plays a role in health is associated with a certain structure, and conversely, every structure that plays a role is associated with a certain process or certain processes. So when we now speak about psychosomatic, about mind-body interaction, psyche and soma, we have to say that the process of getting sick and the process of healing has both physical aspects, bodily aspects, and mental aspects. So there's no such thing as a psychosomatic illness. All illness is psychosomatic. All healing is psychosomatic. So again, that's a tremendous shift, a tremendous expansion of this whole notion of psychosomatic.
And this is really crucial, what you said, that there is no clear scientific explanation that has given some kind of theory or discovery about how the mind arises from the brain. That is a puzzle that has not been solved. And yet, an entire field of mental health treatments emerges that says, well, okay, we we haven't solved this, but we're just going to set it aside and we're going to assume that all the problems of the mind, which may be emotions or stress or whatever psychiatric diagnosis or whatever struggle that people are having on an emotional psychological level they're having at the level of mind, we're going to just set that problem aside and then assume that we can just focus on the brain.
Yeah.
And what you're saying that's completely misconceived, that actually that brain is just one structure in a whole network of structures that is involved in this ongoing process, and the process itself and all the structures, the body, the nervous system, the food system, all the context, the social context that the person lives in, all of that is going to be part of anything that involves mind.
And we know, for example, if there's an event, a dramatic event in my family, or if you have a death in the family, or you have a dramatic traumatic event, I get sick in my stomach. And the stomach is not the brain, but it's still a structure which is involved in this psychosomatic relationship. And the entire organism is always involved. And what you said before, Will, made me think that, an unfortunate legacy of the mechanistic worldview is the refusal of scientists to ask fundamental questions. Like, for instance, in biology, when you study biology, you can get through your whole university study, undergraduate and graduate, and you never hear a teacher ask the question, what is life? Although you might think biology is the science of life, so that should be asked in the first class in your undergraduate years. Similarly, nobody in medical school asks what is health or what is mental health. And this is the same in every field, the fundamental questions are not asked. Well, the systems view of life does ask these fundamental questions.
So are you hopeful that these problems are being looked at in new ways and that there is an emerging shift away from a mechanistic view and towards a more systems view and deeper understanding of how living systems actually work? Are you hopeful that change is taking place? Because you've been kind of like riding the wave of this throughout your entire career since the sort of the beginnings of it in the 60s and 70s.
When we talk about the problems of the world, the most important insight, which is becoming, ever more apparent, is that the major problems of our time, energy, environment, climate change, economic inequality, violence and war, all these big global problems, that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they're interconnected and interdependent, and therefore they need systemic thinking in terms of relationships, in terms of patterns, in terms of processes to be solved. What makes me hopeful, Will, is that our children and our youth live with this systemic thinking, because they live in networks, they live in social media, and thinking in terms of networks is second nature to them. So when I remember when I was giving classes at UC Berkeley, 20 years ago or so, I explained to my students what a social network is. I mean, today, if I did that, they would just laugh, because they know much more about social networks than I do from everyday experience. So networks, of course, are patterns of relationships. And in order to understand networks, we need to think in patterns and in terms of relationships. And our young people do this naturally, just like a child learns the mother tongue, just by copying the adults. Our children and young people learn systems thinking by living in these social networks. And that makes me very hopeful.
You're not concerned that the kind of the technological and mechanistic side of that is actually going in the other direction towards more isolation and more disconnection?
Well, of course, there is the danger. There's technologies always have two sides. Still, when I think back at my teenage years, when I was 16, 17, 18, the status symbol for a boy of my age would be a car, right? A big clunky machine. If you had a car, you have made it. In high school, that's all we talked about. Girls and cars. Those were the two topics of conversation. And so today, what's the status symbol? My daughter doesn't have a car. Most of her friends don't have cars. Some do, some don't, but most of them don't. But everybody has a cell phone. So the status symbol is an iPhone or, some kind of smartphone. Now, this is not a big clunky machine. It's a tool of communications. It's a tool for networking. And they do it all the time. They network every day. So this shift from the machine to the network is also a shift in values, what they value more. And of course, there are dangers of isolation, of becoming too geeky and things like that. But I think all in all, it's a very positive development.
Do you think that it's kind of inevitable that we are shifting towards a more systems view, or do you think that it is taking more activism and more intentional pushing kind of from change agents? In other words, is it a sort of like a general cultural shift that's part of an evolutionary process, or do you think that it might be something else going on?
No, I think it's an evolutionary process, and it would not need any change agents if the consequences of the mechanistic view were not so severe. I mean, all these problems we have, just think of fossil fuels, climate change caused by excessive use of fossil fuels. I mean, the fossil fuel companies spend millions and billions of dollars to confuse people, to promote the idea that climate change is not real, to hide the problems, just to continue as long as possible with their profits. They all know that it's going to end, but they just want to push it as much as possible, which causes tremendous harm. The same with economic inequality. The shift of money from the poor to the rich, which is now the sort of national economic theory in many countries, causes tremendous harm. Now, these are all consequences of seeing the world in a fragmented way, in a separate way. And we do need activism to fight that. We do need to promote the systems view of life.
Yeah, your discussion of this makes me think of just the systems view of activism and political change, because there are so many different individual issues that people are interested in and involved in. And then we can think about what the issues of the future are going to be, especially given all the technological change. But I think that's kind of like a downstream way of viewing, and it doesn't have enough of a systems or upstream approach, which would say, well, why is it that our democratic governance has broken down? Why is it that the votes and the opinions and the views of ordinary people aren't having any kind of counterbalancing effect against industry and unregulated profit and growth, and the way in which the whole system is not responsive to human needs? And I think that points us in the direction of seeing the systems change that needs to happen in the way that we make decisions as a society, so that it's not about money buying votes, but it's about each of us having our vote, which movements, the labor movement, the women's movement, the abolition of slavery movement, the civil rights movement, all these movements have been working for giving us a real meaningful thing, which is the right to vote about our destiny as a nation. And now that's just been completely replaced, or almost completely replaced, by money buying votes. And so I think that would be a really valuable direction for a systems view of political change, that we can get into the rules of the game. Because you mentioned the fossil fuel industry. Well, the CEO and the board of director of all those fossil fuel companies, they're bound by law to make as much profit as possible. They have to maximize their fiscal return. That's in the law that binds those articles of incorporation for those companies. And so if we want to really affect things, it's even deeper than saying pharma or the fossil fuel industry or agribusiness. It's something like about the rules of the game, the system that's been set up for these different industries to operate needs to be looked at, because it's all interconnected. It's not separate issues. It's all these interconnected things that have these relationships between them.
Within the global civil society, this global coalition of NGOs, of change activists, systems thinking is very common. So many of the leaders of this global movement, people like Lester Brown, Hazel Henderson, Amory Lovins, Naomi Klein, Vandana Shiva, and so on. These are just a few of the real leaders of this global civil society. They are all systemic thinkers, and so this is very good news. I would say when you look at the various strata of society or at the various fields, I would say systems thinking is practiced most in the global civil society, in these activists, in these NGOs. Secondly, I would say in some academic circles, not in all by any means, but in some. Thirdly, I would say in business. Again, there are some, advanced companies who practice systemic management, new types of organizations, shift from hierarchies to networks, self-organizing teams, and so on. And last, by politicians. So politicians are the last to really get a handle of systems thinking.
So your first book, The Dao Physics, really was bringing the spirituality in. So tell us a little bit more about how spirituality fits into the systems view of life and systems thinking that we're talking about.
It's very important to distinguish between spirituality and religion. Spirituality is a certain perception of reality that is independent of cultural and historical contexts. You have spiritual people in India, in China, in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, in the US, in Canada, and spiritual experience as an experience of wholeness, of belonging to a larger whole, of being embedded in a larger whole, of transcending the mind-body difference, and so on. This kind of experience is a universal experience that is independent of cultural and historical contexts. Then religion is the attempt to explain the experience and make it the basis of the structure of a religious community, of a system of ethics or morals that are guidelines for this community. And when that happens, and it happens everywhere, religion becomes dependent on historical and cultural context. So the same type of spiritual experience of, say, a Teresa of Avila or Saint John of the Cross in Christianity, and of a Mahatma Gandhi or a spiritual teacher in the East or in Latin America, the same type of experience is interpreted in different ways. And what happened, especially in Christianity, was that the interpretation was confused with the reality of the experience and was presented as dogma.
And would you say that the heart of that spiritual experience is kind of a deep intuition of this systems view of life?
It's not just a deep intuition, it's an actual experience of aliveness. I come back to metabolism being metaphorically called the breath of life. So if you experience the breath of life in a very intense way, in what Maslow called peak experiences, that is a spiritual experience. So you can have this experience in meditation. You can have this experience in a sexual encounter. You can have it in sports. I personally have had such experiences while skiing in the mountains of Austria in my youth. You can have it in art, in listening to a piece of music, or in a dance performance, or any kind of art. So it's a feeling of intense aliveness. And during this experience of intense aliveness, you transcend the boundary of the self and you somehow fuse with the environment around you. And so, for example, when we talk about ecology, ecology is the science of connectedness, of relationships, relationships between members of the earth household, oikos, which is the linguistic root of the word ecology. So when you learn that everything is related in nature, that you have communities of life that are embedded in non-living matter and dependent on non-living matter, then this relates very strongly to an actual experience which you might have when you meditate, in a forest or on a beach. And suddenly you feel connected to the whole environment and you experience the whole environment as being intensely alive. So we see, the systems view of life is, again, the theoretical interpretation as compared to the actual living experience.
Fritjof, we don't have enough time, but give people again the name of your new book and how they can get in touch with you.
The book is The Systems View of Life, co-authored by Pierluigi Luisi and myself. My personal website is my name, fritjofcapra.net, and the website of the Capra course, the online course, is capracourse.net.
Fritjof Capra, thank you so much for joining us today on Madness Radio.
Well, thank you. That was very inspiring and wonderful.
You've been listening to an interview with Fritjof Capra. Fritjof is a theoretical physicist and systems theorist, author of several international best-selling books, including The Dao Physics, The Web of Life, and Hidden Connections. His most recent book is The Systems View of Life, co-authored with Pierluigi Luisi. That's all the time we have on Madness Radio. Thanks for tuning in. You've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Madness Radio host is Will Hall, producer is Nina Packabush. Madness Radio is an affiliate of Mad in America Radio, broadcasting on KBOO in Oregon, sponsored by Portland Hearing Voices and the Icarus Project, and syndicated on the Pacifica Network. Madness Radio is online at kboo.fm/madnessradio and at madinamerica.com.